Hi, everybody. I am Corinne Cardina. I am the Bureau Chief of Healthcare and Cannabis on Fool.com. Before we get started, I'd like our viewers to know we're using a question and answer service called Slido. So you can open that up in your browser. There's also an app. Our code is MF Live. So you can submit questions, upvote other people's questions for the ones you want to see answered. And I'm so excited to welcome Scott Helfstein, like I just said, Executive Director of Thematic Investing at ProShares. Hi, Scott. How are you?
Hey, Corinne. I'm well. How are you?
I am good. So, fools, for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about ProShares' new ETF. It is called A New. I'm going to drop the ticker in the chat, and it tackles four transformational changes that are being accelerated by COVID 19. Scott, can you give us the highlights of what those four transformational changes are?
Sure. And it really has to do with how we've spent our time and how our lives have changed over the months of the pandemic. And if we think about the hours of our day, if we're fortunate enough, we work, we try and take care of ourselves. The way we consume has changed, the way we connect has changed. And how many of us had FaceTime or Facebook apps open at holiday tables at some point in the last 9 months? And so, really, what we wanted to do was put together a set of companies that really spoke to how our lives have changed, but more importantly, how those changes were already in place and were accelerating. And so really there's four of them that we focused on. The first is the future of work. And so we have, for example, things like video conference, but we're also focused on how the changes in remote have facilitated things like automation and the automation revolution. We have genomics and telehealth, which many of us have now actually had a teledoc appointment at some point over the last few months. The number of people that use the service is up something like 4 or 5 times what it was last year. And now we're getting news about vaccines where messenger RNA and genomics, really play a prominent role. The third area is digital consumer, and that gets to social media, streaming, gaming, and the explosion of esports throughout the pandemic. And then the fourth is food revolution, which is one that we think is a little different and people perhaps don't hear as much about. But we saw beef prices go through the sky. It was the largest increase in prices the USDA had ever recorded back when we were seeing the shutdowns during and trying to ensure the supply chain. And so if we actually step back, there's a really interesting story to tell about innovation in the food space that we think investors should be paying attention to.
Absolutely. So, we're going to talk about all these different trends. We're going to dive into some of the specific stocks that the ETF holds within the category and chat about why these trends are likely to endure beyond the pandemic. Before we jump into all that, though, we've had exciting vaccine news this morning. So, I don't want to ignore that. I think my question for you is, was this ETF designed for this current new normal? How do you think these trends are going to endure once a large segment of the population does become vaccinated and some of these things may not be exactly where they are today? How do you kind of picture this on the longer time horizon?
So let me stress, first of all, I look forward to the day when we get a vaccine. I am a proud New Yorker, and we were out at a restaurant that was near empty last night, and look forward to the days where the economy reopens. So this is not a COVID doom and gloom type of a fund, but many of the things that have happened uh, are likely to stay with us. For example, we saw the number of people working from home, the percentage of the population increased from 7% to 42%. That's a six-fold increase. We cannot, by the way, have another six-fold increase. We can't have 252% of people working from home. We can't do that. And we might have peaked at 42 or 49. There are some different statistics that are out there. And that might well start to revert as offices reopen, and we would expect that to be the case. Yet, more than 50% of senior executives are talking about making some sort of flexible work schedule permanent. And so people are not in the office 5 days a week. And a recent Cisco poll, 53% of senior executives said that they were looking at reducing their office space. Even a 20% reduction in office space could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion to $1 trillion of cost savings that will probably be redirected to things like customer relationship management software, artificial intelligence, automation, video conference. So we don't necessarily see many of these changes as receding, right? We think that they'll be a permanent part of the landscape. And really what we're focused on is where do we go over the next 10 years, not the next 10 months.
Absolutely. And I think, we've kind of gotten a taste of a lot of these things because of these circumstances, but something like telework, I've realized that my job can be done 100% remote. Something like telehealth. Once you have been able to log on to a video and see your doctor from your couch, that may be something you're interested in doing even when there's not a pandemic, just because you've experienced the convenience. I definitely see where you're going with that.
And similarly across all these areas, I mean, another one is online retail, and I imagine we'll want to jump into some of the names there, but we saw e-commerce as a percentage total retail sales go from 11% to 16%, and new numbers should be out at some point this week. But to give everybody context, it took 10 years to go from 5% to 11%. 10 years. It took a decade to reach 11% penetration. So for all the people who think that Amazon is taking over everything, all of e-commerce is still only 16% of the pie. And so that doesn't suggest to me that all of a sudden it's going to go back to 11, that there's a whole lot more that it's going to capture. And so it's just going to expand, not recede.
Absolutely. All right. So I have some questions for you about the ETF and how it was designed, and then we'll get into some of these juicy stock names. So my first question is, how do you expect this ETF to behave? How might it compare to the broader market in terms of volatility?
So when you look at the NASDAQ, for example, 85% of the NASDAQ weight is in technology, consumer discretionary, and communication services. And so certainly as we think about things like future of work, a lot of those elements play in. Similarly on the discretionary with the digital consumer. Nonetheless, when you add in food and you add in genomics and telehealth, that has a little bit more of a staples, traditional defensive quality to it. So what we've done is we have weighted each of the four themes equally. So twice a year it will reconstitute to 25% per theme. And so we think that that's a way to balance. So while I can't say I would expect it to be necessarily more or less volatile than a broad index, it has elements of diversification with 143 names currently in the basket. That is I think a little bit more balanced is the right way to phrase it.
Absolutely. So what type of investor might consider this kind of ETF? Would you say this is good for someone who's looking for growth, value, diversification? Any thoughts there?
I think it first and foremost falls into the growth category. We really focused on areas where there is an increasing size of the pie, if you will. So for example, if you're talking about something like industrial automation, US, Europe, China, and Japan will have, based on current worker utilization rates, 125 million shortfall of workers by 2040. And if one robot can do the job of 4 workers, we need 31 million industrial and commercial robots, and there's 3 million in the world today. So those are the types of things that we're looking at, where the pie is expanding. And so first and foremost, investors focused on growth should think about this. Our overarching theme here is one of transformational change. And so for us, those are rapid, high in magnitude, and things that are very hard to reverse out of, right? Turn back the clock. And so really anybody looking for a growth sleeve, and we think actually that this could fall into someone's core portfolio within their equity sleeve as their growth alternative, perhaps different than a Russell growth index that's a little bit more focused. And then also, people who take a core satellite approach, this is a reasonable thematic satellite.
Great. So let's talk about time periods. At the Fool, we are really long-term investors. When we're looking at the shorter side of things, we're looking at 3 years to 5 years. What would you say is the ideal time period that an investor should aim to keep their money in this ETF to experience gains?
We think about it the same way as you guys do when it comes to our thematic baskets. And so for us, when we say theme, there's really 3 things that we tend to focus on. One is technological innovation. The second is demographic shift. And the third is changing behavior, consumer behavior. And really, this captures all of it. And what we've seen in the last 10 months is that so many of these changes have just been accelerated so much faster than anybody believed possible. And so we're seeing these changes play out in a way that was really unimaginable, and yet it still doesn't stop the fact that these are 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, in some cases multi-decade themes. Right? Food revolution and sustainable food, with 2 billion more people according to UN projections by 2050. There's 177,000 new mouths to feed every day for the next 30 years. That is not a short-term trend. That is something that we are going to be grappling with, and we are going to need to bring innovation to bear in order to handle those. So for us, this is a very long-term investment.
Great. That's very helpful. All right. So let's dive in to each of these 4 categories. So I think we're going to start with the future of work, and cybersecurity and automation are 2 trends that I think are top of mind. What can you tell us about these, and which stocks in the ETF especially encapsulate these 2 trends, cybersecurity and automation?
So cybersecurity, we feel as well, is a really important theme. It's actually one in dissecting and doing some work for an outlook that we'll be producing early next month. Cybersecurity is actually one of the themes where the earnings increase of this year has pretty much explained the entirety of the gains. And so we have not seen multiples expand in cybersecurity the way that they have in some of the other areas. And so there's actually one of those areas where it's high growth and still value. And so we have a number of names in that area, companies like FireEye that deliver cloud-based solutions, companies, a company like Zscaler that provides the secure tunnel that people are using to get into their work networks when working remotely. And so those are just a few. And for example, Zscaler's earnings this year are up 40%, and their revenues are up 40%. And so we're seeing really strong growth in these areas as companies try and figure out how to get people working remotely and safely and protect their computer networks. And that's something that I think will just be a permanent part of the landscape going forward. When we think about automation, an interesting name there is Cognex, which does sensor technology. And that's one of those areas I discussed the disruption, for example, to meat supply. We could certainly see in the future that one approach to grappling with that is increased automation. And we know we're going to need more industrial and commercial robots. We know that there's a worker shortfall in the 4 largest economies. And so that's an area that we think is really ripe. And for example, McDonald's, which is not in our food revolution basket, but McDonald's has a fully automated test kitchen in Arizona where there is nobody who actually prepares your food. It is all done by robot. And so those are some of the innovations. And so for us, automation plays in future of work, but really it cuts across automation and artificial intelligence cut across many of the things that we're talking about here.
Awesome. So there are also a couple more traditional tech stocks in the future of work part of the basket. Adobe, I think a lot of people, what comes to mind is, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. Microsoft is, people tend to think about their Office suite and Windows. What are some of the ways that these older tech companies are really transforming and how the pandemic has spurred that along?
Microsoft is a juggernaut, and it's one that's hard for people to wrap their brain around because it is so prominent in WeWork with the Office suite and Word, Excel, and our operating system. But they've taken a lot of their revenue into the cloud with subscription service. And so we see that that cloud and productivity tools make up about 2/3. And it's really interesting that you talk about Microsoft and Adobe because they're actually announced a partnership a little while ago to take on customer relationship management. So CRM is a new segment, the two of them working in conjunction. By the way, Microsoft, as I think you were implying, also has a big gaming division with Xbox. And so as we think about virtualizing work, it's a little crazy to think about this, but what about the virtual reality coffee break or the virtual reality water cooler? And so there are some companies that are uniquely positioned to be able to facilitate a new and different remote working environment. So Microsoft, I think, is one that investors should continue to pay attention to. Really important from a productivity standpoint. And Adobe as well. My 11-year-old wanted a subscription to Illustrator for his birthday this year. And so they're not just talking about PDFs, but they are important in secure document management. However, we've got Photoshop, we've got Illustrator. They also have an artificial intelligence product called Sensei, which actually helps people to do their graphic and document management. And so they are on the cutting edge of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the document space as well.
Awesome. So we're seeing some of these older companies get involved, maybe disrupting something like Salesforce, maybe disrupting something like DocuSign. Do you see them going after those kinds of markets?
I suspect with time they will. But again, it's such a rapidly growing area. I mean, if we think about the revenue growth that Salesforce has experienced, and just the growth of a CRM sector, which quite frankly almost didn't exist in its modern form 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And whether we talk about something like CRM or we talk about cloud, I mean, these are all new areas. We're just at the beginning of these transformations. And I would argue that what makes these companies really interesting is that you need them when times are good, and you still need them when times are bad. And so that whole notion of we're going to have a reopening trade and all the things that didn't do well are going to come back, that doesn't prevent these companies from still doing well. These companies had earnings where Microsoft grew their revenues by 18%. Right? It's a multi-billion dollar company that still managed to get double-digit growth over the past year. And so even if that slows, and even if we do return to the office, we're still going to be using Teams and our collaborative tools. And we need customer relationship management services when the economy's bad, because then it's all that more important to deliver what your clients need in a timely and efficient fashion. And so, I think it's a little bit. I think investors are a little bit prone to think about reversion to the mean, and to say that things can't stay this good for some of these companies. And I think that misses the fact that so many of these businesses didn't exist a decade ago.
Definitely. All right, genomics and telehealth. So I want to start with Intuitive Surgical because this is a full favorite in the healthcare space. It's the company behind the Da Vinci robotic surgery system. It helps surgeons perform minimally invasive procedures. It's got a nice installed base of systems and enjoys a lot of competitive benefits. How do you envision the future of Intuitive Surgical?
Well, you mentioned the importance of robots, and while I am not really a fan at the outset of having not having a doctor in the room to operate on me, nonetheless we have seen surgery number of surgeries have come down during COVID. People are putting things off unless it is really a necessity, and I think any ways we can deliver more efficient and safer healthcare outcomes is a pathway to the future, and it's something that we should be excited about. When we think about something like surgical robots, there's a phenomenal barrier to entry there. You need to get people trained. They're expensive. It's not exactly the type of thing where a hospital is just going to hop off and go do something else. So for a lot of reasons, we think that that's a growth opportunity. It speaks to remote. It speaks to artificial intelligence and automation, and so really encapsulates so much of what we're trying to talk about here.
Definitely. Okay, so that we can get to all four, I'm just going to kind of speed through these. Digital consumer. So let's start with Amazon. Amazon stock up 1,700% in 10 years beyond e-commerce. It's got a lot going for it. Its biggest growth driver being Amazon Web Services, the cloud, of course. Do you think that Amazon can do anything near a repeat performance when we're looking ahead to the next decade? How do you envision this as an investment today?
Well, that's where I get back to that 16%. That is the total e-commerce penetration of retail in America. So we're still early on, as much as it doesn't feel that way for a lot of people. There's a lot more to come, and we're going to be doing more and more online. And so, even their rollout of the Amazon stores or their use of the Whole Foods brand in the food space, I think is all reflective of innovation. And certainly AWS has been a phenomenal success story for the company. So I don't know about repeating past performance, but we do think that we're early in the digital consumer revolution still. So there's a lot more to come, and we saw Amazon Prime Day had the largest sales on record. Alibaba just put out numbers last week from its Singles Day, which also showed phenomenally strong growth year over year. So there's more to come. Not only that, we also focus a lot on margins, and you look at a company like Walmart that has successfully grown its e-commerce business, yet it's done so at the expense of margins, whereas Amazon margins have consistently increased over time. And so we think that that's a trend that they can continue. And some of those investments that they made a few years ago, for example, like their own delivery trucks, has turned out to be a phenomenal advantage.
Definitely. Another trend in the digital consumer is gaming. And so, Scott, I am not a gamer. You're going to have to help me out with this one. We've got EA and Activision as some stocks of interest here. I'm assuming that gaming has enjoyed a lot of tailwinds with everyone being at home and not being able to socialize. What can you share about these two?
Yeah, so just in April, gaming downloads, according to Apple, were up 30%. There are some numbers out there that are really pretty amazing with regards to the number, not just of hours played, but hours watched. Literally 500 million people watch video games. In April, if we look at Twitch and YouTube gaming, which are the two biggest platforms, there were more than 2 billion hours of gaming watched during that time period, according to those companies' statistics. We also saw during the pandemic that Electronic Arts, which has the FIFA, the soccer or football franchise, if you will, they ran a competition that had almost 300,000 participants competing in a remote esports effort. Formula One actually put their drivers into simulators, and people were watching professional drivers in gaming simulators as the substitute for Formula One earlier this year. So this is a phenomenally big and growing market. I do believe that yes, hours spent gaming will probably revert a little bit as we reopen and we can do things like go to amusement parks. But again, this is just the acceleration of a long-term trend. I mean, there's now something in the neighborhood of 100 universities that offer video gaming scholarships.
Wow.
So these businesses will continue to see phenomenal growth over the next few years.
Awesome. Jumping over to Food Revolution. So Deere and Company is not one that comes to mind for me right off the bat when I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch, but maybe it should. How is Deere disrupting agriculture, farming? Why do you think that its stock is going to outperform and be helped by the tailwinds from the pandemic?
Well, I would pose a question that I think a lot of us don't think about, which is, do we think it is easier to have a self-driving taxi operating in a downtown city or a self-driving tractor operating in a field?
Going with the tractor.
As would I. And so, those are the types of things that investors should be thinking about. It's how all these technological innovations in one area are moving into another. And so when we think about, and by the way, why does the tractor only have to till the land? Why doesn't it have robotic arms in order to actually, pick and sort vegetables? And so much of that is done by machine already, and we're taking it to another level. And for example, the use of drones. Farmers using drones, because a drone can evaluate things like oxygen level or chloroplast count in a way that walking through a field you would never see. So if you have part of your crop that is getting sick or that is underdeveloped, you have a much higher likelihood of being able to use sensors from the sky. And so there is so much technology that is going to be brought to bear in food. And Deere, for example, with something like the automated tractor, will be a leading position. They already have the incumbency in terms of the relationships, and they are investing to bring the technology to the customer.
Awesome. Well, I can say that I have definitely learned a lot from you today, Scott. So I appreciate you sharing all these insights with us, and we will keep in touch. Good luck with your new ETF, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks. You too, Corinne.